Hi everyone, and welcome to today's virtual lecture series event. Our speakers today are Jamie Zhao from Nottingham University and Hongwei Bao from University of Nottingham, with a talk titled Queering China, an Emerging Field in the Study of Global Queer Culture. Jamie Zhao is a global queer media scholar, currently honorary professor and director of the Center for Gender and Media Studies in the Department of Journalism and Communication at Ningbo University. Her research spans female gender and sexuality in East Asian and Chinese language entertainment and pop culture in a globalist digital age. Hongwei Bao is currently associate professor in media studies and director of the Center for Contemporary East Asian Culture Studies in the Department of Culture, Media and Visual Studies at the University of Nottingham. He is the author of 4 research monographs in Chinese queer studies. And since earlier this year, both of them are serving as the founding editors of the Queering China Transnational Genders and Sexualities book series published by Bloomsbury. They will say more about that. And now, Hongwei, Jamie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me make this full screen. You can hear me well, right? You can hear me well? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So, hello everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm Jamie, and thanks of course the organizer to organize this event and invite me and Hongwei to give this online talk as part of the HCN's virtual lecture series, and thanks to the audience who was joining us from different parts of the world during weekend. So today's talk actually involves several research and publication projects of us. Our projects in the past several years, most of which actually collaborative work with we two. And we aim to document and theorize various queer cultures, various forms of queer cultures in the transnational, global, even digital context, and to challenge conventional understandings of China and Chineseness, and to internationalize and decolonize queer studies, of course. So for today, our talk will discuss how queering, queer with queer ing with a slash in the queering, this word. Queer in China, we propose as an innovative critical framework in global queer cultural studies. It actually points to promising directions for future research and opens up fruitful conversations concerning how to mobilize cultural studies in a growingly globalized, digitized world and move beyond disciplinary and methodological boundaries. Okay. So the lecture actually contains 5 parts. In the first part, I start the talk and discuss of theoretical framework and analytical lenses, queering China in the context of Chinese-speaking and Sinophone worlds, more specifically, how we reconceptualize or conceptualize and employ the Western originated word queer in Chinese language, media and pop cultural studies, and also explain how our approach draws on and develops global queering theory. And then in the second part, I will discuss queering China as an analytical lens to research contemporary Chinese media and pop cultural landscape, with an introduction to the forthcoming Queer TV China with the Hong Kong University Press, edited by myself. The third part, I will hand the stage back to Hongwei. He will discuss our co-edited Bloomsbury new book series, Queering China, Transnational Genders and Sexualities, and also our co-edited anthologies published under this new series, titled Contemporary Queer Chinese Art. In the fourth part, he will move further to theorize queering as an approach in art studies and in other queer China book projects. In the final part, we will briefly summarize our discussions and also discuss new projects with the Journal of Chinese Cinema, and also hopefully we'll have some time left for Q&A. Okay, to begin with, I would like to acknowledge that queer and its related theories and politics widely known in Anglophone cultural studies actually have of course, Western origin. One of the most influential, for example, scholarly definitions of queer in Anglophone queer theory comes from Eve Sedgwick. In her monograph Tendencies, published in 1993, Sedgwick defines queer as, quote, the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances, and resonances, lapses, and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality are not made or cannot be made to signify monolithically, unquote. So many Western media and pop cultural studies scholars have actually adopted this and similar understandings of queer in their cinema, TV, music, and audience to analyze the anti-hegemonic, non-normative representations and interpretive possibilities. Yet a transcultural appropriation and application of queer theory in trans-language media and pop culture or pop cultural studies has been the subject of academic debates in recent years. For instance, Sinophone scholar Andre Buckner notes that a direct, uncritical use of Western-derived queer theory in transcultural studies is believed to be a form of sustaining Euro-American centrism and risk becoming a weapon in reiteration of the West's global hegemony. Also, queer Sinophone scholar like Howard Zhao also reminds us that although a straightforward refusal of Western-originated queer-related terminology and theories can emphasize a discrete set of historical and sometimes transcultural explanations for difference, it might also lead to a form of local essentialism, and thus this means productive conversations that can lead to a more global synthesis. Meanwhile, within the Chinese and Sinophone worlds, queer this term itself is also a result of transcultural appropriation and cross-linguistic mutation, I would like to emphasize, rather than, as many people often assumed, a worship or a direct uncritical use of Western or say seemingly more progressive ideas. For example, as early as in 2006, film scholar Lin Songhui has recorded that queer, this English word, has become popular in Taiwan in the 1990s and rendered as "cool" literally in Mandarin Chinese, which means cool kid, or weirdo, 怪胎, or strange fetus. Later, Hongwei himself also noted in his work that after this term being appropriated and popularized in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the word was imported into mainland China through some Chinese scholarly translation and literary studies publications around 2003. Therefore, in mainland China, different from the Chinese word 同志 or comrade, which is a word periodically borrowed from socialist rhetoric and refers to the identity discourse of male homosexuality more often. Queer or queer at the time carried a certain celebratory tone and connotations of, rebelliousness, freedom, fashion, and coolness. And queer, this term in the this term in the 2000s actually quickly picked up by China-based media practitioners and artists. So you can see that this historical traveling and meaning mutations of queer or queer, this idea in the three major Chinese-speaking societies had led to the what I call dual meanings of queer or duality of queerness. That means queer can either be a word to describe something fashionable, subversive, cosmopolitan, and avant-garde, or a self-identification point for non-normative gender and sexual minorities, or both. So in addition to emphasizing queer or queer, not simply as a minoritarian or restrictive identity category, such as those, lesbian or gay or homosexuality, which are certainly identity or sexual orientation categories, I would also like to highlight that our approach is well situated within global media and cultural and also gay studies. In particular, we draw on the most recent generation of global queering theory proposed by Frank Martin, Peter Jackson, Mark McLelland, and Audrey Yu in 2008 in their widely cited anthology titled Asia Pacific Queer. So they moved beyond earlier generations of global queer or global gay studies, which often overemphasize the cultural influences of Western hegemony over local traditions in LGBTQ cultural and identity formations. They instead developed they called queer hybridization model, which underscores the way in which both Western and non-Western cultures of gender and sexuality have been and continue to be mutually transformed through their encounters with transnationally mobile forms of sexual knowledge. Unquote. So, taken together, queer ring, queer slash with the slash in it, queer ring, as an analytical lens in our research actually explore the disruptive, negotiative, anti-Western centric force in normative discourses and ideals on not only gender and sexuality or what we call heteronormative discourses, but also about nationality and modernity. And actually, interestingly, this duality of queerness I discussed above also led to at least the two mainstreams of queer trans media and pop culture scholarship in the post-2000 years. And the first strand is to explore grassroots activism of and media productions by self-identified gender and sexual minority groups in the trans context and examine their related, non-normative identity formation and social political change or movements. So this line of research, in this line of research, queer is more politicized, identity-related term. Hongwei perhaps will discuss this line of research later. The second line aims to highlight the disruptive and negotiative potential of queer in mainstream media and pop culture and public spaces, without necessarily emphasizing the linkage of queer media and culture to LGBTQ identity, politics, and social activism. So in this part here is queer is less identitarian based. Instead, the second line of research believes queerness is ubiquitous in mainstream society and media and serves as an indispensable constitutive limits of heteronormative culture, which actually explains why a heteronormative, still largely homophobic society like China has had such a burgeoning queer media culture for at least 2 decades. More importantly, this second line of research also emphasizes that this enhanced visibility of queer pop culture does not necessarily indicate we have an increasingly open-minded, queer-friendly, or feminist-supportive social and political environment. My own research actually lines up with the second line of research more and shows a more complicated picture here. For example, in 2017, I collaborated with 2 other scholars, Mao Levin and Lin Yang, and published a co-edited volume with Hong Kong University Press titled Boys Love, Cosplay, and Androgynous Cultures, Queer Fan Cultures in Mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So this book is the first English language academic text about queer trans fan studies. In the book, we appropriate queer and radically redefines it as called a productive analytical lens that defines itself critically not against heterosexuality, but against the normative, including any perspectival norms and ideals in both contemporary public culture and scholarly discourses surrounding nation-state, linguistics, geopolitics, ethnicities, genders, and sexualities. Therefore, it serves as an umbrella term used in this volume to loosely refers to all kinds of non-normative representations, viewing positions, identifications, structures of feelings, and ways of thinking, unquote. In this definition, as well as my later publications, my employment of queer built on many influential definitions from Euro-American queer theories and queer media studies, such as the one proposed by Eve Sedgwick, Alexander Doughty, Joseph Butler, and Jack Helpstam. But I also revise and contextualize it in contemporary transgender and sexual situations, simultaneously shaped by local traditions and global influences. In other words, rather than sustaining Western centrism or local essentialism, I use queer as a critical perspective to examine the transcultural encounters and hybrid results of local and global gender, sexual, and media cultures. So this use of queer as both a creative practice and also an analytical lens has been quite prevalent especially when you're looking at transcultural queer readings and queer fandoms nowadays. In 2020, I published 2 special journal issues. One is with the Journal of Feminist Media Studies on the topic of queer pop in post-2000 China, and the other one is published with the journal Continuum and co-edited with Hong Kong U-based LV Wang, titled Making a Queer Turn in Translanguage Media Studies. Both special issues emphasize that we can bridge queer theory with transmedia studies to analyze queer cultural elements and phenomena within mainstream mass entertainment media, such as homosexuality in trans TV dramas and androgynous idols, homoeroticism in commercial films, and same-sex tensions in reality TV, for example. So these 2 projects strive to push forward the more loosened up definition of queer or queerness. We can actually see that the 2 lines of queer Chinese media or pop culture research actually are converging with each other in more productive and meaningful ways if we look at publications in more recent years. In my latest anthology that will be forthcoming with Hong Kong University Press, again on trans queer TV and Spanish imaginaries in the 2010 years, I propose the framework of queer ring to consider queer as a noun, a verb, and an adjective that is used to unveil whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant, and to interrogate non-normative ways of being, doing, desiring, and imagining in and through mainstream media, cyber, digital, and public spaces. So through this approach, I combined the 2 lines of research discussed earlier and emphasized both self-conscious, identitarian-based LGBTQ subjects in contextual, specific feminist and media politics, and the non-identitarian and often temporary, fleeting moments of non-normative embodiment, performances, and intimacies. This lines of this our analytical approach was also discussed in my co-authored piece with Hongwei, published earlier this year as part of notes from the field in the online commentary section of the journal Critical Asian Studies. The paper titled Queering China, Theorizing transgenders and Sexualities Through a Transnational Lens, where we further emphasize that, as you can see if you check out the online publication, as the journal editor highlighted when formatting of online paper. Quote, queering China is a heuristic to explore queerness and Chinese-ness through an intersectional approach that is attuned to the encountered synthesis and dissonances of local, transnational, and global queer and feminist studies, knowledge, and movements. Unquote. So go back to Queer TV China's book. My idea of queering China, in fact, is extended to a framework of queering TV China, where I focus on TV, of course, and argue that this use of queer can be advanced to co-for research that highlights the self-contradictory queer-enabling potential of mainstream television discourses in China. So a queering of TV China sheds light on the ubiquitous existence and negotiative power of queer, which works productively within and against, and sometimes also colludes with mainstream heterosexual media cultures and spaces. By recognizing the intertwined queer and normative dimensions of television as a mainstream social-cultural platform in China's heteropatriarchal and authoritarian society, research on Queer TV China helps to unveil both the potential and the problems associated with television industrial cultural specificities. So in general, the lens of queering TV China can be used to explore the power of various TV genres and narratives, sensorial practices, fandoms in queer desiring voicing, and subject formation within a largely heteropatriarchal society. My discussion of this approach to Queer TV China was also published as an advanced online commentary in 2019 via Critical Asian Studies. Since the book is not officially out yet, so I just briefly show here how our authors together use Queer in China as our Queer in TV China as a lens to explore queer trans TV culture. The book contains 10 chapters, including one introduction and 9 individual original studies that are divided into 3 sections. In the first section titled Queering Genders and Sexualities Through Reality Competition Shows, we can see that reality TV actually we argue that reality TV is one of the queerest TV genres, often characterized by easily adapted formats and performativity in representing reality, gender, sexuality, and race or ethnicity. As I have argued in one of my earlier publications on female homoeroticism in trans reality singing competitions produced between 2006 and 2016, set in homonormative societies, these features of reality TV competitions can actually offer and intensify ambiguous yet ubiquitous homosocial settings and same-sex erotic tensions. Meanwhile, some other research has attributed the state-backed popularity of reality TV in the 21st century PRC to the genre's own ideological propagandistic function in promoting, say, positive or happy voices to the audience and articulating the government's ethno-nationalistic projects such as China or China Stream or rule-seeking in sonic or visual representations. So this also partly explained why reality TV is intrinsically both queer and hegemonic, as well as both ideologically orthodoxic and commercially successful in the PRC. So we look at the queering and queer aspect of trans reality TV. In this section, we explore popular reality TV shows in recent years, like Youth with You, and also Sisters Who Make Waves, and also Let's Exercise Boys, which is a sports reality TV show. The second section in the book, Queering TV Dramas Through Media Regulations, focuses on the transnational, cross-linguistic circulation and consumption of queer TV dramas in and beyond the Chinese-speaking world that have always been under the government's cultural surveillance, economic exploitation, and political manipulation. Meanwhile, we also discuss the queering potential of Chinese media censorship itself and the intrinsically queer nature of media censorship in a growingly commercialized, globalized, and digitized trans-language video space. So this section contains 3 chapters that, from different perspectives, emphasize the queer enabling power of the seemingly repressive official media policies and the negotiated potential for contemporary queer queer Chinese television production, distribution, and consumption. The last section, called Queering Celebrities Across Geocultural Boundaries, shifts its focus to issues concerning post-2010 queer trans-language TV star and fan status within a transcultural dimension. Queer Chinese TV stardom and fandom in the first decades of the 21st century were largely shaped by inter-Asia and global queer media such as Japanese BL media and Western LGBTQ pop cultures. So we find that post-2010 global TV market and transnational TV flows have allowed further queer dynamics and possibilities, which have been mobilized by trans-speaking queer stars and fans. Therefore, the last 3 chapters of Queer TV China examine this queering phenomena in the transglobalization of and participation in transnational and global TV, celebrity, and fan cultures. Our authors provide cross-cultural comparative perspectives for studying the intricacies of queer TV stardom and fandom in different Chinese-speaking societies, as well as across geopolitical borders and linguistic boundaries. So since we just mentioned the media censorship of homosexuality when discussing queer trans culture, I would like to spend a bit more time on this topic in the last part of my lecture. To understand how trans media censorship of homosexual content works, first we need to know that homosexuality it's not illegal or also not also not a mental disease in contemporary China. For over 20 years, homosexuality was decriminalized in 1997 and depathologized in 2001 in China. And LGBTQ content is also not considered politically sensitive as long as no explicit activism or protest involved. In other words, it's actually in a more gray area. Meanwhile, there has been some scholarship concerning Chinese media censorship as rigid or strict. I don't think that can fully describe Chinese media censorial policies or practices. In fact, if you check official documents from the government, from the nation-state level censorial system, the guidelines have never been clear. It's always been vague, general, and changed very frequently, and also have some sort of flexibility or leeways for interpretation. For example, there are always some policies about portraying the positive side of the society. But how to define positive is done by media producers, audiences, and also different levels of official media censors. We actually also have many different levels of content checking, reviewing, censoring in media production systems, such as media production company level content reviewer, provincial level media censors, municipal level media censors, and national level media censors. And the standard for censoring and controlling media content and production are also varied at different levels. So we can say it's censorship is very subjective, depending how individuals interpret those related guidelines. So think about this, even for the list opened up the most illiberal time of modern Chinese history, say Maoist time, Maoist China. We still have this kind of socialist posters, 社会主义大字报, with pictures portraying two hyper-masculine and possibly cross-racial adult men holding hands and standing by each other in intimate ways. And this kind of image is so positive in a socialist way, but also so queer or male homoerotic to some extent, which is very self-contradictory in a highly authoritarian, suffocating political environment at the time, right? So anyway, despite all this, go back to contemporary time. Since 2008, official media policies have always lined homosexuality or homosexual content up with pornographic, sexualized, abnormal, or vulgar content and censor it. Sometimes LGBTQ film festivals, communicative platforms, and even feminist and queer social media accounts were subject to periodic crackdowns in China because they were being accused by possibly collusion with foreign forces to subvert the government's authorities. So it's not about LGBTQ per se. It's more about sort of threatening the social political stability of the nation state. In other words, China's media censorship of homosexual content not only involves practice of self-censorship, but also the political ideological manipulation of LGBTQ content, and whether LGBTQ or homosexual content can contribute to the stability or positive side of the mainstream society. In this sense, the media censorship system itself cannot be simply described as repressive. But I would rather use Singaporean and UK-based media scholar Huang Haowei's words. I would say it should be viewed as ambiguous, inconsistent, and generative or productive. And the way it works is also shaped by the often self-contradictory attitudes of the official censors at the various levels of media production and broadcasting, as well as the self-censorship of media practitioners who tend to produce materials that are commercially successful, less politically offensive to the conservative morals of mainstream Chinese consumers. So the last thing I would like to discuss is how queer in China can be imagined or used as a critique in the rhetoric of the Chinese or China dream. I feel most of the discussions on queerness or the linkage between queerness and the Chineseness happened in the in the conversations produced by queer Sinophone scholars about things happened outside of PRC, outside mainland China. I also would like to stress that even within the PRC, or from the top of the official, top of from the top down level, the meaning of Chineseness is also constantly negotiating with and reconfigured by what is queer, and sometimes more importantly, not only from socio-cultural marginalized groups, but also from media industries and official political discourses. Just to give a quick example, I wrote a short chapter for the 2019 China Story Yearbook published by the National University of Australia, in which I argue that the Chinese Dream is in fact a national project proposed by President Xi Jinping, right? So this Chinese Dream project in fact combines nationalism, China-centrism, cosmopolitanism, and neoliberalism. It doesn't go against, but instead tries very hard to include its own version of queer dreams, which the authorities believe would help to promote a so-called positive and inclusive discourses domestically and benefits its own national soft power and modern image on the global stage. For instance, as shown on the slides, in the past several years, we can see that the progression of LGBTQ legal rights in Taiwan and Hong Kong, right, which outside of PRC, right. For example, on May 17, 2019, Taiwan became the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. On the second day, in an English post on Twitter, the party state's mouthpiece, the newspaper People's Daily, which belongs to owned by the PRC, right, celebrated Taiwan's move towards LGBTQ rights with a "Love is Love" gif. In the meantime, the statement from on Twitter from People's Daily actually attributed the decision, this progressive decision, to so-called local lawmakers in Taiwan as part of the bigger Chinese nation state. In other words, China subtly owned legislation that applied only to same-sex couples in Taiwan while asserting Beijing's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. So you can see this can be a very classic case showcasing LGBTQ culture is not politically sensitive or strictly ostracized or silenced in the PRC, especially when they can actively contribute to the national image on a global stage. So to the next slides, I will hand the stage back to Hongwei. Hongwei, it's your turn.
Sure. Thank Jamie for providing the theoretical as well as historical context for our project, Queering China. So I'm now going to focus on the book series with Bloomsbury, as well as 2 book projects that we're currently undertaking. While I'm taking over the slides and doing the IT transition, I would like to thank ACS for supporting our research during the past decades. So I remember that I deliver my book launch at a Crossroads Cultural Studies Conference in Shanghai in 2018, and also a lot of colleagues and teachers and friends are all here today among the audience, including my PhD supervisor, Professor Catherine Driscoll from University Sydney, Australia. So thank ACS for all your support for our research. So first, the book series. So last year, a Bloomsbury editor got in touch with us regarding queer research. And Jamie and I thought this would be a great opportunity, first to, in a way, to document queer culture in the Chinese-speaking sphere and Chinese cultural sphere, because this is underrepresented, underdocumented. In China, such publication opportunities were virtually non-existent. So we can only actually publish overseas or in an international context. On the other, we need to propose the queering China paradigm in order to challenge, for example, conventional understandings of Chineseness, queerness, as well as art and culture, art history, cultural history. So I'm based in a cultural studies department with art history, film studies, and media studies. So that means my focus are primarily on cultural productions such as literary and visual culture, queer performance and art, and so on. So this is a project that I've been undertaking during the past few years, which is documenting Chinese visual and performance culture, which hasn't been systematically documented. So including my monograph, Queer China from 2020, and this year's new monograph, Contemporary Chinese Queer Performance, and a forthcoming book co-edited with Jamie and DE, forthcoming next year, Contemporary Chinese Queer Art. So the purpose for these books is to think about what queering China might mean in a scholarly context, in a transnational context. So some of you may recognize that my book titles or book cover design really comes from the artworks of Zhao. So Zhao and Mingming are two lesbian or queer artists based in mainland China, and they produced fantastic artwork from 1990s, yet their works were or have been less known or hardly known in an international context. I'm fascinated by their artwork not only because they represent queerness or homoeroticism, but that they really open up our imaginations about what queerness can be, what queer Chineseness might be. For example, you can read those works as queer women's intimacy along the kind of more identitarian lines. But at the same time, if we pay attention to processes, materials, forms, objects, etc. of their artworks, we might actually think about queerness in a more capacious way. For example, the first one is a photo documenting and performance artwork. So this actually can be interpreted in different ways. For example, exploring the relationship between human and nature and how to position yourself in a kind of modern and neoliberal and industrial society. And then the picture on the right-hand side is a fantastic, actually, visual representation of what I call post-socialist metamorphosis, which is transformation of subjectivities, desires, and genders, etc., in a post-socialist context. But it also actually showcases these kind of elaborations of human subjectivities, forms, and creativities in a different way, in a material and in an artistic sense. So another famous Chinese queer artist who is probably better known, the name is Ren Hang. He's a queer photographer. So a lot of his photography works actually feature, in a way, same-sex intimacy, but it's more than same-sex intimacy. They are also about different forms and configurations of body and how bodies relate to each other and how, for example, human beings relate to the non-human world and form this kind of interspecies intimacy. So those artworks are interesting, not simply because what they tell us about same-sex intimacy, but it's also about how those intimacies can be expanded to a wider terrain, including non-human, including nature, and including many other things, built and natural environment. So this inspires me to think about queering China in relation to artistic and cultural productions. So, for example, in the interviews with Zhao and Ren Hang, so neither of them said that their artworks is about censorship, is about critiquing, for example, the kind of Chinese government and so on and so forth. Yes, I mean, the expression of queerness exists in that particular context of censorship, but censorship is not the only story to tell. What's also interesting is that what are the other forms, what other ideas that queer art can tell us, and what subjectivities and social relations can queerness, bring about? So I'm also drawing on Han Yip's recent work on minor China. So Yip argues that on the one hand, there's a major China, as we know, as represented in mainstream media, that China is an authoritarian state and so on, and queerness, so gays and lesbians are repressed in China. But on the other hand, there are actually other forms of subcultural forms and queer existence, and lifestyles and identity formations, and so on, and creative forms that have pretty much gone unnoticed or under-noticed in the study of queer China. So this is what I'm trying to bring about. So my work is, on the one hand, create a visual archive of contemporary Chinese queer culture in the post-Mao era from the 1970s to present. On the other hand, to think beyond the so-called repressive hypothesis of Chinese queer culture and look at what lies beyond censorship and what can we learn actually from Chinese queerness. So for Yip, we tend to emphasize our major narratives around resistance, a romanticized notion of liberal free speech, while setting aside both seemingly minor details about aesthetics as well as complex actions by the state and by people as well. So this informs my research on queer culture, both in visual, literary, and performance forms. These are fascinating because these cultural artifacts remind us that they're more than representation. So we can conduct loads of textual analysis on those artworks, and we can conduct a lot of political analysis to examine the relationship between the state and queer people, but that's not the end of the story. We can also look at their materiality, objects, a relationship with people and with the world, and the context where they are situated in, where they're relating to, and where they transform. So I'm really interested not simply about representation, but also how those production and consumption activities or circulation activities transform the social relations and transform what we know as China and queer China. So what I'm going to do, so this is also a methodological, challenge or exploration, which is how do we examine queerness beyond the textual analysis and ideological critique. So queer Chinese studies or scholarship in the past has been very much drawing on or relying on literary studies approach and film studies approach with a meticulous attention to what lies in the text and what hidden messages and insidious, for example, manipulations that lies behind the text. But I'm trying actually to look at those artworks in their lived realities, in their materialities, and in social relations. So this is a book that will come out in 2 weeks' time. So you can already actually order a print version or order an ebook. So it's called Contemporary Chinese Queer Performance. It's about theater and different forms of performance in contemporary China from the 1970s and 80s onward. So it's a queer theater history, but it's more than a theater history, because performance in a way is really a great way to look at cultural production, to look at cultural text beyond the textual things, beyond the textual level, because you really see how people put together the performance, or the kind of political economy as well as material conditions of the cultural production, as well as how audience, performers, producers, etc. form flexible assemblage and to shape the queer performance culture in a particular way. This is also a not strictly theater studies book, because I understand performance in a broad way as, in a way, the enactment of the body in an elaborate manner, conjuring up both the notion of performance and performativity. So I start with two forms. So one is photography and the next one is queer cinema. I then move on to the use of performance art in Chinese queer activism, including the flash mob activities and so on. So this is then followed by some stage performance or dramatic performances, which include one of the earlier queer performances in China, East Palace, West Palace. So many people may be familiar with, for example, the novel or the film, but what would a theater version be? And then there is also a documentary theater exploring the relationship between parents and children. This is particularly relevant for the queer community due to the difficulty of coming out. And then there are also, actually, more recently, during the pandemic, since a lot of artists cannot perform live, they have to do online and digital performance, how those digital performance artworks speak to the contemporary geopolitics when there's a stronger antagonism between China and other parts of the world, the Western world. So my examples actually will include, for example, the theater documentary Convergence, how queer activists use documentary and live performance for activism. So another example is, of course, this kind of stage enactment of East Palace, West Palace. What's also interesting is that this actually uses the Western modernist theater techniques, such as the theater of the cruelty by Artaud, and it also conjures up the homoerotic and sadomasochism images. So these forms are itself interesting. They can be read as national allegories, but they are all more than national allegories. The forms and aesthetics deserve serious treatment by themselves. And this example, which is a documentary theater about my parents and their child. So what's also interesting is this intermediate element. For example, the light, the projection, and so on interact with human beings and tell stories. We can call them intermediate or even transmedia storytelling. So unfortunately, in a lot of queer China research, the focus is so much on censorship that those aesthetic and formal characteristics got lost in the process of translation. So following the performance book, I'm also looking at queer art. So the queer art, contemporary Chinese queer art, is an edited volume, bring together about 20 queer artists, curators, and scholars, and so on, co-edited by Jamie D and myself. So this book is interesting because we not only bring a variety of queer voices from artists, curators, and activists, etc., but also think about what queer art might mean. So as you might know, that in queer art history, the queer art history as we know it is very much Western-centric and primarily based in America and Europe, etc. So Asia, Africa, and other countries are seen as not having queer art, or they are all seen as ars erotica in a kind of more orientalist, primitive way, as Foucault would say. Okay, so for this book, so first part, queering forms and materials and traditions. Second part, feminist interventions. Third part, feminist queer and trans curation. We see curation as a type of activism, or engaging with not only the traditional curatorial practices and principles, but also engaging with the social reality, with the museum and art gallery and theater settings. And last but not least, we take those artworks in an international context and look at queer diasporic politics, and in particular in the context of the pandemic. So to give you a few examples, so regarding queering forms and traditions, on the left-hand side, you see the paper cutting artworks by Xi Yade. So Xi Yade is a rural migrant queer paper cutter. So paper cutter is always seen as a very legitimate Chinese national or folk culture, but it now actually has been transformed into queer art by having those kind of homoerotic themes. On the right-hand side, you see a painting by Li Yongfei, which basically draws on Chinese ink painting, the kind of landscape painting. You can still see them, but it's in a way printed on a nude male body. So that itself actually is really interesting in terms of forms and traditions. And you'll also see those artworks depicting same-sex intimacy. They might not be created by queer identified artists. And when they were exhibited in the 1990s, early 2000s, etc., they were not seen as queer art as such. But what if that we conduct a queer reading of all those artworks? What if that we see those works as artworks? So essentially to rescue the queer works from the art history, or to construct or reconstruct a queer archive. So what we are currently doing is not only to queer those disciplines such as Chinese studies, art history, and queer studies, but also to think about how to, think about queerness and Chineseness in a different way. And queerness doesn't necessarily have to be denoting identities, and Chineseness does not necessarily have to denote any centralized identity, and it doesn't even need to lead to a major China as we know it. So it can challenge those dominant narratives. This is also about how to insert queer voices of non-Western countries, origins, and cultures in the history of global queer history, art, and activism. So that's my part of the presentation. I'm now going to switch over to Jamie so she can make a conclusion.
Thank you, Hongwei. Switch to part 5. So to conclude, our research draws on links together theories, methodologies, and analytical lenses. In you can see that global queering theory, globalization studies, Western queer media and audience studies, as well as Chinese gender and sexuality studies. By doing so, we aim to use the lens of queering China to challenge both Western centrism and the local essentialism, of course. And our approach radically redefines queer as both an identity referencing point and a creative practice in not only daily life, but also media industries, which actually help to better understand today's burgeoning queer scene in post-2000 Chinese media and public spaces. We also caution against a celebratory tone in understanding the rise of queer representations in Chinese entertainment and public spaces by unveiling the intricate relationships between the inter-Asia and global cultural flows, local Chinese feminist traditions, contemporary Chinese social political situations, official media policies, and LGBTQ cultures. I think what we do here is to on the one hand, recognize the usefulness of the critical logics and the deconstructive power of some Euro-American academic dialogues for understanding contemporary Chinese queer media and pop culture. On the other hand, We also acknowledge that queer is not limited to the Western context, but as Patrice Liu also like wide-sidedly and very influentially argued, queerness and Chineseness are mutually shaping and implicative. The starting point for queer Chinese studies, so we would say, to especially aim to get rid of Euro-American centrism, should be to understand Chinese popular and public spaces have never fully or truly operated in a Western imagined normative way. So Hongwei and I have done in what I have done in the past several years actually aim to establish new fields of queer cinema studies, queer TV China, queer Chinese cinema studies, and queer Chinese TV studies, queer pop China, queer Chinese fan studies, queer Chinese screen cultures, queer Chinese entertainment industries, and queer Chinese art studies. So with the establishing of our new book series, Queer in China, with Bloomsbury, we look forward to collaborating with more scholars from all over the world and expand further the scope of queer in China, of course. Last but not least, I would like to mention our next project with the Journal of Chinese Cinemas titled Rethinking Queer Chinese Screen Cultures of the 21st Century. This special issue aims to explore queer commercialization, mainstreaming, space carving, imaginaries, authorship, cross-cultural and transnational communication, consumption, visual documentation, and grassroots activism through various forms of screen and visuality. Our authors seek to redefine the emerging ways to conceive queer Chinese cinema, media, and arts. We also highlight the creative means and venues through which these queer Chinese screen cultures circumvent censorship to reach a wider audience within and beyond mainland China. So the project entails critical explorations of understudied queer Chinese screen culture, such as queer independent documentaries screened at international festivals, transnational and cross-racial production and distribution of queer trans-language films, trans Chinese cinema, and web-based cyber TV series. Queer cinema mediated community activism and the lesbian filmmakers' visual documentation and oral narration of Artist Village. So diverse set, you can see diverse set of methodologies and texts or case studies will be employed in our project. So we possibly will hold further talk events for this project later after it's published. So that's all we got for today. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much. We'll hand over the mic to Virginia.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk and thank you for the links. So if the members of the audience want to copy them, save them, and we will also include them in the description when we post the video recording on the Internet Archive. I will just post the instructions on how to join the audio if you want to ask a question live, or you can type the question in the chat. I think Idan had a question. The hand was raised, so Idan, if you want to join the audio, the floor is yours. We now unlocked everyone. Thanks for joining.
I think Catherine might have a question.
Yeah.
Catherine, there was a noise from your side, but we couldn't.
Hi, yes, I'm trying to see if it's working. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Hongwei and Jamie. Excellent to hear your work. Obviously, I've been following it for a while, so it's great to hear you give a presentation. I actually had a broad question. based on a recent experience with supervising a mainland Chinese student on a PhD, and a question was raised when they were trying to get ethics clearance about whether or not it would be, let's say, a problem for them in their future career in China if they were seen to be doing feminist or queer research, and whether or not it was something that, in fact, an ethics committee should discourage because there would be no home for their work in a Chinese, academic institution. So I know it's a broad question, but I wondered if you could reflect on that. What are the obstacles or difficulties of doing this research in the context of Chinese studies of Chinese gender and sexuality?
Can I answer this question first, and then Jamie can add? Because when I was doing my PhD, Catherine, thank you for helping me with the ethics clearance. So at that time, the ethics clearance wasn't that difficult because that was considered to be the kind of the golden years of Chinese activism, and there are more Chinese and Western scholars writing about Chinese queer activism. There was a strong sense of optimism. But now the situation has changed in recent years, and doing feminist and queer research has become more problematic in the eyes of the authorities. Having said that, I still think that it really depends on the topic of the research, and it also depends on the particular circumstances. For example, I know that there are scholars both in China and in the West conducting Chinese queer research. There are even Chinese students, PhD students finish their study in UK or Australia or USA and went back to China and find their work. Although actually after they find their job, most of them would have to depart from their own original research and pursue a new line research, such as social media research or creative industries research, etc. I understand the difficulties, but I would also think that now what we call the Chinese queer communities or Chinese academic communities is also transnational. We also see more and more Chinese students finding jobs or working overseas and internationally. So there's no straightforward answer to this question. Everybody needs to do their risk assessment. The political and social context is clear, but it's probably not that clear as we would imagine. I think that there are still actually gaps and lapses, etc. So that also relates how we conceive of this kind of social structure and how we can break away actually from thinking about a monolithic China as thinking about the assemblages of different factors, such as the individual's research, personality, and the job market and the university where he's going to work in the future. So what I think is complicated is probably the lazy answer, but it is a decision that a person has to make in relation to their assessment and understanding of the context and conditions. Jamie.
Thank you, Catherine, for your very interesting question. Actually, I will just briefly answer this question because, I'm a global queer media scholar. I study queer feminist pop culture, and I based in China, mainland China. And I came back to work in China since 2018. After that, I actually find tons of at least hundreds of scholars work related to my own research or relevant in relevant fields actually already come back to work in find teaching and research positions in mainland China. So the thing is kind of similar to what I talked about media censorship. LGBTQ or feminist is not particularly politically sensitive if you not talk about, involve any kinds of activism, social activism or political cause. That would be fine. If we talk about like Chinese boys, Japanese boys love, or those kind of male female homoeroticism in literary culture or in TV culture, cinema, that's actually fine. I think Hongwei actually supervised some PhD students who already graduated and find job also in mainland China in local Chinese universities. I came back first working at a collaborative university based in Suzhou, and collaborated with the UK, a university based in UK. So I feel I got, of course, at this kind of collaborative international environment, I got more freedom, but I don't think it's particularly sensitive, especially if you study fantasy, not reality, if you're working in local Chinese universities. That sort of answered your question?
Yeah, in other words, cultural representation is probably okay, but activism is not.
Yeah,
Right, that's
also
very
if you study, sorry, I just want to add that also if you can check out those Chinese language publications about feminism or women's study, if you criticize feminist activism or racial activism in the US, that this kind of research is more encouraged. So yeah, that's my answer.
right. That's super interesting. So I'm very grateful for your replies because it puzzled me, because this is my 7th mainland Chinese PhD student, all of whom have worked on feminist or queer topics, and the very first time I've ever encountered this pushback of whether or not it's dangerous, whether or not it's bad for the student. But it's only the second time that I've had a student dealing with contemporary activism. And so maybe that is the difference. Maybe it's the contemporary activism that makes the difference. Anyway, thank you very much. That helped a lot. Hand over to someone else now.
Our pleasure.
Great, thank you, Catherine. If we don't have any other questions, I can maybe ask one. You mentioned, or you talked extensively about queer community media and commercial media. To your knowledge, is there any, what is the interrelation between them? And is there a dialogue going on between the producers of the community media and queer and commercial media? Because they have very different agendas, and as we saw with recent BL adapted dramas, the commercial media might attract a little bit too much attention to some aspects which then might not reflect very well on the guidelines for community media, for example. So if you can say something about that would be great.
I will try to answer this question first, because I think the way I talk about commercial media actually quite different from the way Hongwei talked about commercial media. I remember, if Hongwei, you could, of course, you could like say more about this later. I remember in one of your books that you actually talked about back in 1990s or early 2000s, you talked about those TV shows in mainland China actually already invited LGBTQ activists or publicly out people on or this kind of very popular talk shows to talk about their own experience, but they often framed as others, or like what I would say is they always part of the media spectacle of Chinese commercial media. I focus more on post 2000 or post 2010 commercial Chinese media. What I find is most of those actually they are not queer public figures. They're actually more like queer cultural entertaining elements. Those gender non-normative, seemingly sexually non-normative public celebrities or performances or public image, actually they never openly out. They just play with this kind of queer connotations. That's why they are not really censored, but became highly commercialized, become a part of the attention grabbing elements in commercial industry. So that's why they are not censored also. So Hongwei, do you want to talk about queer community? Yeah, you published
sure.
a book on it.
Yeah. So that's a book of queer media in China, which is primarily about community media. I think that the category of community media and mainstream media or commercial media is useful because it points to the aspects of media production and consumption, so for whom it is produced and by whom it is produced. And this is important. But let's also not forget that we are, in a way, actually living in an age, well, even China is undergoing its neoliberal reforms, transformations, and so on and so forth. So what's considered community is not necessarily antagonistic or antithetic to what's mainstream or what's commercial. For example, so the dating app Blue, which is probably the largest gay dating app in the world, which is a Chinese company. And would you say it's a commercial media or it's a community media? We can say that it's a community media because that's where queer people meet and date and so on and hook up. But we can also say it's commercial media because there are lots of adverts and there are even live streamers, and those live streamers would actually encourage people to buy presents and to donate money and so on and so forth. So I think that in today's media environment, probably while recognizing the legitimacy of these two terms, we also have to remember that neither is static. For example, a lot of community members, queer identified people work for mainstream media, and they sometimes actually push for mainstream coverage of queer people. So of course we see problematic mainstream representations of queer people, we see queer baiting, we see queer coding and so on. But queer members, group members, in a way, are also playing a role in this process. After all, most mainstream media are aware that in this age, I mean, sex sells. So in a way, the queer and the queer market is a big market and is a lucrative market. So under the conditions of censorship, a lot of mainstream media and commercial media would try queer themes without talking about rights, activism, etc. For example, boys love drama is such a good example. So it is queer-themed drama, but it never talks about identity, community, or activism. It's purely for entertainment. So I think that with those in mind, it is still possible to talk about the kind of as convergence of community and commercial media in a kind of digital and commercial context.
Great, thank you. And any more questions from the audience? We'll just give a moment for everyone to type. If there are no more questions, then we will let everyone go. I think it's high time now.
Do we have more
also,
questions?
yeah, there are people typing. So the links are in public chat and also in the shared notes. You can copy them from there.
Also, we are happy to review, and if you have any questions about the our new book series and want to talk about your ideas for book proposals with us, please feel free to email us. And the book proposal is for a whole book. And Hongwei, did you post the
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Proposal? Okay, templates.
So
you can find the.
Yeah, Alyosha posted a question. I would like to ask about the comic book and the webtoon culture when it comes to distribution of homoerotic narratives, both in commercial sense and in terms of community impacts. So Jamie, do you want to respond to that?
I haven't. Okay. Comic book. particularly study comic book webtoon? Interesting question. I would say you mean comic book. You mean those kind of hard copy, right? In print ones and those web-based ones.
I'm reading it as including the Japanese type of anime and manga and so on. So it can be both online and offline.
Okay. I think this kind of fandoms of in general Japanese ACG culture based in China actually also part of feminist and queer affective spaces. I would say that. I think our friend, mutual friend Lin Yang actually studies this topic further. I would say, because if we talk about satellite TV dramas or online-based dramas, I would say like online TV dramas, those TV shows broadcast in cyberspace actually goes through. They only need to go through very loose censorship, so their content would be more homoeroticized, if you will. But those I assume those comic books in print published by. Do we have even Japanese, BL officially published in China? I don't think so. I know there are some published in Hong Kong or Taiwan. I don't think they are allowed to publish in China. They are overall they're queer focused.
Okay,
Do you know any?
At least a few years ago, actually, when censorship was relatively loose, and there were still self-publishing. For example, there are those self-publishing website when you submit manuscripts, etc., and then you print on demand. So that type of business model existed. But ever since in recent years, when the boys' love and so on became more problematic in Chinese society because of the government censorship of boys' love. So this becomes less and less possible.
Yeah, more popular forms of this kind of homoerotic comic books actually, or literature actually published by authors based in mainland China. But in recent years, especially in the past decade, we got like a very high profile productive author got arrested, or put into prison even because the government believed that they produce produce pornographic content and circulate it to the public. So that's violate some sort of law. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you for all those discussions in the chats. They are really interesting and useful. So please read the information in the chats. So which on the one hand talked about the existence of a gray zone, but on the other hand, still the stricter policies and censorship within in mainland China today.
Xiaofei just made a very interesting comment. So this is that BL writers sometimes would publish with Taiwanese publishers. Yeah, you have to publish with the so-called non-mainland Chinese or non-mainland Asia presses, and then you have to purchase from overseas, right? And if you bring those books illegally or not officially published in mainland China, it's kind of risky because it's also sort of violating certain kinds of law.
Yeah.
Not to mention, during COVID-19, we are not allowed to, those global mobility and those transcultural consumption purchasing also got quite limited, right? Got forbidden even. So, yeah.
I'm also responding to Alyosha's comment that in that case, I mean, under such situations, it makes very little sense of feminist critique of this genre. Actually, there are feminist critiques of this genre. So a lot of feminists have pointed out that these those representations reify the kind of homoerotic desire and valorize the gay male identity and construct certain role models such as top and bottom and so on. So these, in a way, reproduce the heteronormative and patriarchal culture. Yes, such critiques always exist, especially in the online space.
Yes, exactly. That's why queer fan culture will actually publish an anthology on this topic. We in the very first paragraph of the introduction of this book, actually, we said almost like every queer fan space in mainland China is online based, because you can easier for them to consume this kind of queer content. Most of the queer content, especially in the first decade of 21st century, actually they are from overseas, from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, UK, and America. For example, my own research in that book talked about transcultural fandom, Chinese transcultural fandom of American lesbian TV shows, which never officially released or purchased in mainland China. You can buy you can use this kind of VPN or what's it called, P2P, this kind of software to watch those kind of TV shows, or you can purchase illegal DVDs underground, those kind of pirated DVD VCDs to watch those kind of TV shows, overseas TV shows.
And now it would be more of online streaming and illegal streaming or legal streaming. So Xiaofei made a really interesting point. What's so impressive was that Chinese streaming sites still will also collaborate or cooperate with overseas media producers, boys love dramas and so on. So yes, so remember that despite the kind of censorship environment, all those websites, all those streaming platforms, etc., they are also businesses, and they know well what the audience want. So they are treading a gray zone, but most of the censorship regulations are not clearly cut, and one just have to try their luck.
Yes, Untamed. Yeah, there's a large a global fan base of Untamed, right? Yeah, that's what I said. In second decades of 21st century, China's media started to seen as queer by or consumed as queer by non-Chinese audiences. It's a big shift.
Yeah, thanks everyone for typing in the chat. We have this really wonderful discussion going.
Great, Xiaofei. Looking forward to your anthology. So Xiaofei mentioned Maria Alberto and Kathy Yue Wang are co-editing an anthology on the Untamed. Looking forward to that. Yes, so I will also advertise Jamie's book, Queer TV China. If I remember correctly, there is a chapter on that. Is that?
There are actually 3 chapters talking about the Untamed. Yeah, it's a hot topic.
Yes, forthcoming next year or?
Hopefully, actually, we are quite ahead of everything, so hopefully the end of this year.
Mm-hmm.
All right, do you have a link for it already, so we can include it? Or you can send it to me by email and I will add it.
I'll post the link. Mm-hmm.
We don't have the cover design yet, but yeah, we have this official website set up.
We do have a Word document with all those links, which we can pass on to you after the talk.
Okay, yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
All right, do we have any more questions, comments? This was really a lively discussion going in the chat. If not, we would like to thank Hongwei and Jamie for their time today, and thanks to the audience for joining us, for engaging in the discussion. I will just take a moment to advertise the next talk that will be on 18th of August by Fangyan. Thanks everyone. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the audience. It was really great to have you.
Thank you, Evgenia and Alyosha, for your support. And thank ACS for this wonderful event.
Everybody have a great weekend. Thank you.